Thank you, Suzanne, for that too generous introduction. Now I'll fall flat on my face in its wake. Thank you all so much for coming out. Thanks. I want to reiterate to the sponsors, thanks to Marcia, and really thank you all for coming out to ponder over the deeds of darkness. It's not an easy topic to talk about, but in my estimation, it's the greatest human rights challenge of our generation. And it's important to bear in mind from the beginning that this is something that, although it's miserable to talk about and although the scale can seem overwhelming, it's a problem that we can end in our lifetime. First of all, I'm scheduled, I think, to talk here for about an hour. And I'd like to break that up a little bit because I have the sense that this is a pretty knowledgeable crowd. And so I'd like to leave some time at the end for questions. And I tend to go on. An anecdote from last night, I was doing a taping of Larry King Live in New York. And the fellow guest in studio with me was the actress Lucy Liu, and we were talking about modern-day slavery. And at a certain point in the break, she turned to me and said, "I'm going to need a drink after this." And so afterwards, with the producers, we went downtown and got a drink. And I was just thrilled. It was my first time meeting Lucy Liu, and she's this vibrant, incredibly intelligent actress who's, not to mention, stunningly beautiful. I feel like I'm really getting into the stories of and talking about how she can get more fully involved in abolition. And I thought I was really engaging her, and I was really hitting top gear around the third scotch. And then she says, "Oh, before I forget, let me give you my card." And she hands me this card. She hands it face down, and then I turn it over, and you won't be able to read this from where you are, but in Garamond font there are two words, and it says "Stop talking." So I took that as an admonition that I tend to go on too long. I will try not to do that here, and I will leave plenty of room for questions and answers. I was just emailing with her, and I said, I need a whole a packet of those for when I fly internationally, and I need to get some sleep on the flight, and I have a talkative seatmate. About a year ago, I was in that situation. I was coming over from Hong Kong, and I had a speech in I can't even remember what city it was. I've flown 250,000 miles this year. It's been completely overwhelming. But it was in the States. It was an overnight flight, and I knew I needed to get sleep. I had a very talkative seatmate, and she said, well, what do you do? Classic, lead question. And I said, well, I'm a specialist in mass atrocities, in modern-day slavery and child rape. And that usually ends the conversation right there. and then I can get some sleep. And in lieu of the stop talking card, that seems like the most direct way to kill the conversation. But in this particular instance, she said, "Oh, well, modern-day slavery, I know something about that. I'm a banker, and I have 2 mortgages in 2 countries, and I am I have to work sometimes 80+ hours just to pay off those mortgages." And I said, "Well, how much do you make?" Mid 6 figures, and I said, "Well, what I'm talking about is a little bit different. In the eyes of their employers, the people that I'm talking about are actually disposable." And she, sharp as a whip, said, this was right after the financial crash, and she said, "Do you know anybody that worked for Lehman Brothers?" And I said, well, sure enough, I did, and he'd been laid off the week before. And I realized that it was going to be a much longer conversation, and I realized that I wasn't going to get much sleep that night. But hopefully, I made a convert, and hopefully, I'll do that with a few of you here today. Slaves and slavery. The term has become a metaphor in society for undue hardship. It's become something that we toss around. We either think of it isolated in the past, in sepia-tone photographs, the real chattel slavery that happened much to the shame and the disgrace of this country prior to the American and right up through the American Civil War. We think about it isolated in the past, or we think about it as a metaphor. And if you look up in Merriam-Webster dictionary today, slavery, the first definition is drudgery or toil. You have bankers that refer to themselves as high-paid wage slaves. You have Cristiano Ronaldo, the highest-paid soccer player in the world, when Manchester United wouldn't let him out of a contract that paid him $24,000 a week to play soccer. He said, "I'm a modern-day slave." And the head of FIFA, the head of the International Soccer Organization, said, "Yes, this is modern-day slavery." That's not what I'm talking about. My definition, the definition that I use, and the reality of life for more people today than at any point in human history, is that slavery is the state of being forced to work, held through fraud, under threat of violence, for no pay beyond subsistence. These are people that cannot walk away from their jobs. And it's incredibly important to understand that definition when we talk about the scale of modern-day slavery today. By that narrow definition, there are more slaves today than at any point in human history. The base numbers start with the International Labor Office estimate. This is based on government statistics. There are 12.3 million forced laborers, slaves, in the world today. The higher end estimate, and the one that many other UN organs and the US State Department often refers to, is that there are 27 million slaves in the world today. And if you were to plot those slaves on a map, the vast majority of pins you would have to stick in South Asia, in the Indian subcontinent, in Pakistan, in Bangladesh, in Nepal, in Sri Lanka, and especially in India. There are quite possibly more slaves, almost definitively there are more slaves in India than the rest of the world combined. And these are slaves who escape the notice of their countrymen. They're viewed as just members of the crushed caste known as the Dalit caste. Not every member of that caste is a slave, but almost every slave in India is a member of that caste. Now, the form of slavery that you see dominate in the world, and in that part of the world in particular, is what the UN in its deathless prose refers to, I should say sanitized prose, refers to as collateralized hereditary debt bondage. This is essentially people who are like a man who was actually 40, looked about 80, who I met and whose story I tell in the book, and who I got to know over 2 months of slipping into his quarry at night when the overseers and his master were not around. His reality of slavery began 2 generations before him, when his grandfather had taken a loan to pay for the meager bride price of this fellow's mother. The loan was for 62 cents. And 3 generations and 3 slave masters later, that loan had been accruing at an astronomical interest rate that really meant the details of this were lost on this fellow because he was illiterate, he was innumerate. All that he knew was that if he tried to walk away from work, or if he didn't show up to work, he would be beaten. If he tried to walk away, he believed that he would be found and he would be killed. These are people who, in this quarry, not only this man, but his children and everybody in this village was enslaved to one of 2 slave masters. And essentially what they were doing, the work of modern-day slaves is in almost every imaginable industry. And in this particular case, what they were doing is they were taking large slabs of rock out of the earth, and in many cases it would be the children, it would be the under-10s that would plant the blasting explosives and you can imagine the kind of injuries that would, or death that would result from planting these explosives if you're a 6-year-old. But they could get into the tighter crawl spaces. So they would take these slabs of rock out of the earth, and then they would beat the rocks into gravel with pikes and mortars, with very basic primitive tools. That gravel was used as the subgrade, in some cases, for India's roads, India's infrastructure projects. It's important to bear in mind that anywhere you are in India, slavery is never far below the surface. And then they would further pulverize that gravel down into sand, into silica sand, which is an essential element in glass. And there's only one way that you turn a profit off of handmade sand, and that is through slavery. And the fellow that was the master of this village had become one of the wealthiest and most powerful men in that district by exercising sheer violence and exercising total control over his slaves using unchecked criminality. He was known by local police. He was on local police ledgers to have killed 5 rival contractors who were Brahmin, who were high caste Indians. He was known by local police to have killed 5 Brahmin. These murders dated back to 2008. I was visiting this village in 2006, and he had never been brought to justice. He was known by the local villagers to have killed over a dozen of the slaves, and those murders didn't even register on the local police ledgers. He was a serial killer. And you can ask yourself, is it a worse crime to be a serial killer or a slave master? And it's an academic question, and frankly, like so much in academia, and I say this being up at Harvard now, it doesn't much matter. To those slaves, to those who were enduring that reality, they were enslaved to a serial killer. And the point is, he never faced justice. And to this date, he has not faced justice. And one of the questions that I had for this fellow who I named Ganu in the book, as far as I know, he's still in slavery, and I took great pains to protect the identities of those that are still in jeopardy. And one of the questions that I had for him was, why don't you run? Why don't you just get out of here under darkness? Because I was able to slip in, he should be able to slip out. And part of my feeling about this, and the reason I asked the question, was I'd been reading the writings and the speeches of Mahatma Gandhi when I was on the train going to Allahabad, to this village, and the Mahatma had this terrific quote where he said, "When a slave decides not to be a slave, the bond is snapped and the fetters fall." It was this soaring sentiment that slavery and freedom were mental constructs. When I asked Ganu why he didn't run, he said very simply, where would I go? How would I eat? If I run away, first of all, Ramesh, his master, will find me. Second, if I happen to make it, how would I feed myself? Since he was a child, he was born into slavery. And so for Mahatma Gandhi, slavery was a mental construct. But for Ganu, slavery was his world. And Ramesh was God in that world. Yes, he was the taker of life, but he was also the giver of sustenance. And this is a critical piece of understanding how we eradicate bondage, to understand the methods and the means and the reality of that codependency, to understand that in order to do emancipation right, and we tried to do emancipation in this country at the point end of a gun, and my great-great-grandfather fought in the siege of Petersburg with Grant's army, the final battle that bled the Confederate army white. And he was driven by the desire to end slavery. And my other ancestors from the 19th century were Quaker abolitionists who stood up and railed on against slavery on their soapboxes in Connecticut. And slavery was ended at the point of a gun. But when it was ended, we dumped 3 to 4 million new Americans onto an economy with no reparations, with no access to credit, with scant tools, resources, rehabilitation to deal with the new economy. And 150 years later, we are paying the price for that botched emancipation. And throughout the latter half of the 19th century, Southern blacks were re-enslaved using other means. There's a fantastic book that you should read, of course, after you read mine, called Slavery by Another Name by Douglas Blackman, which won the Pulitzer Prize this year. And it's all about that process of re-enslavement. This is why worldwide, in countries that have weaker rules of law than the United States, this is why slavery continues. Slavery continues where corruption thrives. Slavery continues where poverty and social isolation are left to fester, to metastasize, to grow. There are 1.1 billion people in the world today living on less than $1 a day. Now, not all of them are slaves. Not all of them are slaves. And the end of slavery cannot wait for the end of poverty.
So lost. No, I am not, man. Dude, I dropped my phone. Oh, the road! Whoa! Okay.
How would you like to save your life from an ugly, reckless driving death? Don't answer yet! There's more! Act now by slowing down, and we'll guarantee you complete satisfaction!
That's awesome!
In the real world, there is no spokesperson to prevent reckless driving. There's only you. Speak up.
Whoa, Andy, slow down.
But those 1.1 billion are desperately vulnerable. And when a trafficker comes to them, as a trafficker, for example, the one that I was negotiating with 5 hours from where we are here in Port-au-Prince, Haiti, and I was negotiating with this trafficker to buy a 12-year-old girl, this trafficker would go and he would take advantage of that desperate, withering poverty and social isolation. He would go up into the hills of southern Haiti, and he would go to these villages where there were no rural schools, where there were no medical clinics, where there was scant food, subsistence farmers who barely had enough crops to feed themselves, let alone their families, which in some cases the children would number up to a dozen in one family. And the traffickers would say, "Mommy, Papi, I know you can't feed your daughters. I know you can't feed your sons. Give me just one of them. Give me just one of them, and I will save that one. I will give that child a better life. I will give that child an education. I will give that child food. I will give that child critical life-saving medicines." And faced with the uncertain fate of this stranger that comes in and is asking to take care of the child, and versus the certain fate of watching that child slowly starve or degenerate and die of a preventable disease, millions of parents every year make a devil's choice between watching their child definitely die or giving their child to a trafficker and an uncertain fate. You hear a lot of talk very, very loosely in the media about parents that sell their children. I didn't find parents that sold their children. I found parents that succumbed to fraud, that succumbed to the lure and the promise held out by a trafficker, somebody who offered them a better life for their children and thus pried their children using the most venal leverage imaginable, which is the love of a parent for their child, an almost evolutionary instinct, used that instinct against them and took those children into slavery. And let's stay with Haiti for a moment. In Haiti, there are, according to UNICEF, up to 300,000 children held in domestic bondage, in domestic slavery, meaning they are forced to do domestic chores in homes that are not their parents, that are not headed by their parents. They are forced to cook, they are forced to carry water, they are forced to clean, they are forced to change the bedpans, they are forced to do all manner of work. And as I said, 5 hours from where we are right now, I'm assuming, how far are we from Newark Airport here? 40 minutes. So maybe actually we're closer than, well, we're probably about 5 hours. 5 hours from where we are, 40 minutes to Newark Airport, 3 hours from Newark to Port-au-Prince, Haiti, and an hour from Toussaint-Louverture Airport in Port-au-Prince, Haiti. There's a place in front of a barber shop where I pulled up in a car, I rolled down a window, and there were men standing in front of this barber shop, and everybody in the neighborhood knows what these men do. One of them came over and said, "Do you want to get a person?" And we began negotiating in broad daylight. I brought out my tape recorder, and in other instances, and I witnessed negotiations for the sales of human beings on 4 continents, and in most places I would wear a wire under my shirt because people were aware that they were violating not just national laws, but international laws and human laws. In Haiti, at the time when I was there was a provisional government in place. There was UN peacekeepers were keeping force. There had been a coup a year earlier, and parts of Port-au-Prince were gang-controlled, parts were completely anarchic. But the irony is I was in a part that was actually fairly calm, a part where the UN peacekeepers had been able to seize some control over the various aspects of daily life. And yet there was no, and there is no law against human trafficking in Haiti. And so this man was openly offering a child, a 12-year-old girl, for domestic labor. And I made it clear that I wanted the child to be able to cook, to clean. I said I would give the child a place to sleep on the floor. And at a certain point, the trafficker leaned in and he said, "You know, this is rather a delicate question, but would you want this child as a partner as well as a domestic?" And my translator made it perfectly clear what he meant by partner. we're talking about a 12-year-old girl here. And for the 300,000 child slaves in Haiti, the vast majority of whom are girls, rape, sexual abuse is part and parcel of their daily bondage. And so, how much does this child, who I was negotiating in broad daylight as if I was haggling over a used stereo, and it was that same sort of level of joviality, and you can hear it in the tape. You know, we're sort of laughing and going back and forth, and I'm saying, "Oh, you know, that's too much. You know, come down on your price. That's the Prix Blanc. That's the white price you're giving me. I want the local price." The asking price was $100 for this child, and the negotiated price within 2 minutes was $50 US. This was for a domestic and a sexual slave. And I had a principle throughout this book that I established through consultation with those that work to free slaves, those that work to keep slaves comprehensively free, and to stop slavery from metastasizing from its already historic proportions at the moment. And these people who run shelters, who conduct raids, who get slaves free, begged me, do not pay for human life. You will be giving rise to a trade in human misery. You will be monetizing a trade that in many cases in these local settings is a bartered arrangement. You will be incentivizing a crime against humanity. We've seen it over and over again where journalists will come in and NGOs will come in and they pay to free individuals, and the traffickers are that much more powerful, they're that much more incented to go out and get more slaves. So it's one thing to understand that and to act accordingly and not pay for human life in Haiti, where I wasn't presented with this girl. This fellow, this trafficker, said that he would go and he would find a vulnerable family and bring the girl in, and I obviously stopped him from doing that. And I reported his actions to the police later that day and gave them the tape. The response, by the way, was, if this is a negotiation between two families, we don't get involved. It's one thing to understand that idea of not paying for human life when you're not presented with the individual. It's another thing when you're, as I was, in an underground brothel in Bucharest, Romania, by the main rail terminus, in a rundown, loathed district of Bucharest, and you're presented with somebody who I was told would be a blonde. I was told that she would be a blonde and that they were making about 60 euros a day off of her. And local police later estimated that probably meant that she was being raped between 6 and 10 times per day at very low price. And as I was waiting with my translator and my fixer who had brought me there, who was himself a low-level criminal, not a human trafficker. He was actually a credit card scammer. You make some interesting friends when you do this kind of work. We heard a scream, and we quickly went up to find out what was going on. And as we got up to the top floor, a girl was brought, a young woman actually, was brought out of a darkened room where it was completely dark, even though this was the middle of the day. She was brought out of this room, and one of her shoulders was hunched, and because the trafficker was holding her, gripping her arm very tightly, and the other arm was covered with angry red slashes where I have to assume that she was trying to escape daily rape the only way that she knew how, which was by killing herself. And this young woman had the visible effect of Down syndrome. And in an attempt to make her sellable, the trafficker had put makeup on her. And she was crying so hard at that point that the makeup had run. And this young woman was offered to me in trade for a used car. And I walked away from that situation, and in this case I found a dedicated prosecutor who said that she would investigate, but said, I'll tell you what, chances are, if we get that girl out, she's not going to testify. She'll be too scared. Her mental state will be too shattered, and it's possible she wouldn't even understand what was going on. That relationship of dependence that I referred to earlier will have been cultivated. And the challenge for all of us is to break that relationship of dependence in all forms of slavery. So I want to step back just for a second, because I talked about the scale of debt bondage. There are between 10 and 20 million people in debt bondage. According to the U.S. State Department, 600 to 800,000 are trafficked. Trafficked meaning human trafficking is another euphemism, another sanitized term for the modern-day slave trade. 600 to 800,000 are trafficked across international borders into slavery each and every year. And lest we think that this is some foreign ill, that you have to travel 5 hours from where we are. According to the Justice Department, there are between 14,000 and 17,000 that are trafficked into slavery each and every year here in the United States. Put another way, if I'm sticking to my guns and speaking for half an hour, and I think I'm already well over that probably, but in that half an hour, on average, one more person will become a slave here in the United States while we're sitting here pondering over the deeds of darkness. So, what did I do? You know, I often ask myself this now, and it's, being a journalist, you have this idea that you will observe and not engage, and my model for writing this book was my friend and colleague Samantha Power's book on genocide called A Problem from Hell, which was a beautiful, magisterial book that won the Pulitzer Prize the year that she wrote it. And her subject, genocide, was a horrible subject that she wrote with sensitivity and grace and a sense of compassion throughout for the victims, but also a certain degree of academic detachment. And I realized, and you could take any point along the continuum here when I was writing this book, but take that moment with the girl in the underground brothel, or take moments subsequent to that. Take a moment in this summer when I was doing a story for a Time magazine that'll come out later this month, or maybe in early January. It depends what happens in Tiger Woods' world. I found a girl, I found several young girls who had been sold into human trafficking networks around the World Cup stadiums. And one of them I was interviewing on a cold Friday night. It was 0 degrees out, and she was alone in a hospice. She was 17 years old. She'd been sold a year earlier, raped repeatedly, beaten by not only her traffickers but by her clients on occasion. And she was in this hospice because she'd been kicked out on the street a week earlier because she could no longer stand up. She had full-blown AIDS, she had full-blown tuberculosis, and she was 3 months pregnant. And as I was interviewing her, I was wiping, it was freezing in this state-run hospice, and she was all alone, and she had one thin blanket. And she was sweating so profoundly that, and I had just this little paper napkin, I would wipe her sweat, and as soon as I would wipe it, she would beat up again. And at the end of the conversation, she said, "Nobody knows where I am. I need you to take care of my body." This is a 17-year-old girl who's asking me this. You have to imagine the tragedy of such a short life. And she asked me another thing. Actually, she said one more thing to me. She said, "Thank you for listening to my story." And I realized at that point that I was the first and I would be the last to hear her story. And a week later, she died.
News. Every ton of recycled paper saves enough electricity to power a 3-bedroom house for an entire year. Answer the call. This could be good. Hey.
And so when I think about her, and I think about the other children that I saw on the street that night, and one of whom I approached, and I tell the story in the Time magazine piece, I encourage you all to pick it up, one of whom I approached, and I asked 3 questions. I said, "How old are you?" She said, 15. "Where are you from?" "Eastern Cape." "And do you need help?" And she said, "Yes, desperately. I've tried to escape 3 times, and each time I've been brought back." And in a moment like that, I go back to those ideas of objective journalism, of observing and not engaging. I go back to Samantha Power's sensitive detachment if such a thing is possible, the way that she described these problems somewhat at a distance. And I realized that the difference between the victims that she was describing is that the victims that she was describing are dead. And the victims that I was writing about and researching and talking to and investigating are very much still alive. And today, in many cases, they're very much still in hell. And in this one instance, and in one other instance that I describe in the book, I got involved. And I didn't pay the trafficker that held that girl. And by the way, this is one of these sort of, my photographer on this piece, who was a devout Christian, said this is, the hand of God. I don't know what it was, but it was fate, coincidence, hand of God, what have you. That girl that I was asking those questions of was the only person who knew that girl who was dying in that hospice. They were best friends from childhood, and they'd been sold by the same recruiter for $35 each in a bag of crack to a Nigerian human trafficking network. And I described the process of getting her out. Suffice to say, I didn't pay for her freedom. Suffice to say that there was a fight. Suffice to say that we went into a crack house. I went in with a couple of former Special Forces guys. And suffice to say that that girl, that 15-year-old, is safe. And when I pulled her out of there, when I pulled her out of there, it's not just a question of liberation. Again, I go back to those first principles. It's not just a question of liberation. It's a question of enabling slaves to become survivors enabling survivors to become citizens, and sometimes, if those slaves are so, and those survivors and those citizens are so driven, they can become abolitionists and they can lead the charge to abolish slavery. I think of Frederick Douglass, I think of Harriet Tubman, I think of Sojourner Truth, all the way up through the years. I think of Maria Suarez, who I was on Larry King Live with last night, who should air at some point in the next 2 weeks. Again, Tiger News notwithstanding. And those will be the leaders of change. And we must listen to them. We must listen to former slaves, we must listen to survivors, and we must break the cycle of dependency of those slaves that are still held in bondage. And for this 15-year-old girl, I knew that that meant some access to education, which she couldn't have gotten in her township, which was the poorest township in the poorest district in the poorest state in South Africa, unless she had some support. And the amount of support that we were talking about was, I think it was $150 to cover everything for 1 year. And I found a Chicago couple, 2 lawyers in Chicago, that said, it's a no-brainer, of course we'll do this. And through a social worker who cared passionately about this case, because I was watching her very passionately, and also I think cared passionately about the case because she began to understand about human trafficking. Even though there's no law against human trafficking, there's no standalone law against human trafficking in South Africa, much to its shame. And prior to the World Cup, they're asking for a cataclysm unless their parliament gets behind a new law on human trafficking. But with the help of this social worker, with the help of the Chicago couple, and with the help of a community that we rallied, this girl is in school, this girl is learning how to be free, and this girl is HIV negative. And again, you look at the hand of fate here. And I think about those, I did about 8 comprehensive multi-hour interviews for the purposes of this Time magazine story, and most of them aren't in the piece. 7 of the interviewees, who were all trafficked, are HIV positive or had full-blown AIDS. And one of them, the girl that we got out, is HIV negative. And if we don't act, then those who are held in bondage in places like South Africa, where among the general population we're talking about a 25% HIV infection rate, those who are held in bondage will die while we do nothing. And so the question is very much, what do you do? And I'm so glad that Suzanne cribbed from my website. I encourage plagiarism of everything that's on there, and in suggesting ways to get involved. And I'll go over those really quickly, and then I'm going to open up the floor for questions. And so be prepared to fire away. But very briefly, first of all, understand what modern-day slavery is and spread awareness. Spread awareness. I want everybody here to, by the end of this month, talk to 10 people. Talk to 10 people about modern-day slavery. You don't have to force them to read the book, but just make sure you work in the definition and the scale. I'll pledge to do that. I mean, it's kind of a no-brainer because it's my job, and I'll be going out on Larry King, and so I'll be hitting 1 million people in one night. But, if everybody here pledges to talk to 10 people, by the end of the month, we will have a movement. We will have a movement just emanating from this one room that is approximately, I'm terrible at math, but I think it's about 50 times the size of the original 12 people that started the original abolitionist movement in 1787 in the UK. 12 people sitting around and deciding to abolish a trade, deciding to do away with a trade that in scale at the time was about the equivalent today of the world of the global automobile industry. 12 people. And within 20 years, they had banned the trade of human beings into the United Kingdom. That was the first abolitionist movement. Right now we're on the fourth. Right now we're on the fourth. And I very much hope it's the last. So spreading awareness, getting involved directly. And if I'm supporting this through sales of the book, I'm giving a quarter of my royalties to a group called Free the Slaves, and I gave the Dayton Literary Peace Prize to a group called Free the Slaves. The amount that came with the Dayton Prize was enough through Free the Slaves programs to free an entire village permanently, to stay with that village, to make sure that they have access to credit, to make sure that they have legal representation so that they are not re-trafficked, to break the cycle of bondage in that village, and to stay with them for a program that lasts between 3 and 5 years. This does not cost a lot of money. On average, Free the Slaves programs, and I highlight Free the Slaves, they're actually the American wing of Anti-Slavery International, which was the organization, used to be known as the Anti-Slavery Society. I think they probably changed it because it was a terrible acronym. I just thought that. That was started in 1787. That was started in 1787. It's the oldest human rights organization in the world, and in the last 10 years they've gotten very, very good at what they do, which is not only freeing slaves but eradicating bondage. On average, it costs about $400 to free and comprehensively rehabilitate a slave. You multiply that out by the high-end estimate of the total number of slaves in the world today, 27 million, and you get to a figure that is roughly between 10 and 11 billion dollars, which sounds like a lot of money, until you consider what we spend 10 to 11 billion dollars on as Americans every year. Just out of curiosity, how many people in this room principally buy your groceries online? Okay, I do this everywhere because I don't know anybody who buys their groceries online, and yet apparently 10 to 11 billion dollars is the amount of money Americans spend every year buying their groceries online. It's the amount of money that we spend every year on Valentine's Day for a chocolate that may be slave produced. It is the amount of money that we were spending every month on the war in Iraq. And for that amount of money, directed to the right programs, like Free the Slaves programs, we could comprehensively eradicate a crime that has gone on in this world for 5,000 years. It is a profound moment in human history when we have a chance to do this. Because although there are more slaves today than at any point in human history, as a percentage of humanity, there are fewer than ever. The laws, the first 3 abolitionist movements, and the laws that they brought about have meant something. They have meant that we have the tools in place to force governments to do their job, to free slaves and to keep them free. But in order for those governments to do their job, our government first has to do its job. There's an excellent law that was passed at the end of the Clinton administration, embraced in the early years by the Bush administration, and then sort of underfunded, radically underfunded actually all the way along. But it is the law that it is an American burden to pressure foreign governments to free slaves, and if those foreign governments do not act in good faith to free their slaves, then it is the American law that those governments should face sanctions, should face non-trade sanctions. It's also the American law that we help those governments, we partner with those governments that are willing to fight slavery by providing development assistance targeted towards those communities that are already being targeted by traffickers. It's also the American law that we eradicate bondage within our own borders through ICE, through the Department of Homeland Security, through the Justice Department. But here's the thing. The amount of money, the amount of federal outlays that we as a government, and when I say we, it's because we own our government. In a democracy, we own our government. The amount of money that we have spent since 2000, since the passage of that law, altogether to fight the traffic in human beings is the amount of money that we spend in 3 days to fight the traffic in illegal drugs. And this is not to diminish the relative horrors of smoking pot. But it is to say, no, and of course the war on drugs tears apart communities, it tears apart individual lives through addiction. But it is to say, where are our priorities when we are more focused on a 15-year-old who is selling pot in the street and prosecuting that 15-year-old as a criminal, as opposed to prosecuting a man who buys or sells a 15-year-old for rape? Where are our priorities? So, again, we own our government. We own our government. President Obama, during his candidacy, pledged in a not very well covered debate at Saddleback Church in California, he pledged that fighting human trafficking would be a top priority of his administration. But it's not who in Washington says that they're against slavery, it's how high up in their inbox it is. And it won't be high up in the inboxes of legislators and federal officials unless it's high up in our outboxes. At the moment, there's a bill pending in Congress called it's being sponsored by Chuck Grassley and Max Baucus, and it calls for a comprehensive responsibility and transparency on the part of corporations as to the inputs of slave labor into their products that we as American consumers are buying. At a very basic minimum, we should not be supporting companies by purchasing products that have slave inputs. It's just simple. It's just no nonsense. But the problem is corporations will resist revealing their supply chains unless consumers demand it. So through choices, and unless legislators demand it, and supporting Grassley and Baucus in this piece of legislation is a vital first step towards getting corporations to do the right thing and make their supply chains transparent. There are a whole lot of ways to get involved, and we can talk more about this in the question and answer, but the important thing is that you get involved. Henry David Thoreau, who was writing to a friend 2 days before the outbreak of the first shots were fired of the American Civil War. He was writing to a friend who'd been reading reports of slavery and the rumbling disunion in the New York Herald, and he wrote to this friend and he said, "If you know of it, you are particeps criminis. You're a partner in the crime. What business have you, if you're an angel of light, to be pondering over the deeds of darkness?" And he meant that as an admonition. He was torn between his pacifism and his abolitionism, and he could see that it was about to tear the country apart. I took it, and I hope all of you take it, as an exhortation, as a call to arms, as a call to get involved. So let's talk about how to make that happen. Thank you all so much for having me. So, do we have a...